From a young age, we are told to go to school so that we can get good grades. This mindset is instilled in us from day one, and we are taught that these good grades will give us a good degree and then help us to get a good job. The purpose of getting a good job, of course, is to live a financially comfortable life. But with inflation being very high in most Western countries, it's now not only the poor, but also the traditionally middle class who are struggling to make ends meet. And now is a perfect time to discuss this topic. So in this video, we are going to be going over the scam, which is the working system. Now before we have a look at the problems that we face today, we must actually acknowledge what has happened in the past. Nowadays most people are used to working 40 hours a week. While some people do work much longer than that, 40 hours is generally speaking a normal amount for most people. And this is still a long time, but things did used to be a lot worse than this. The 40-hour work week can draw its modern roots back to the Great British Industrial Revolution, when in the 19th century a man named Robert Owen initially raised a demand for a 10-hour working day in 1810, and by 1817 he had formulated the goal of an 8-hour day, and coined the slogan 8 hours of labour, 8 hours recreation and 8 hours rest, and that is how people wanted to spend their time. Now prior to this, people could be working as much as 16 hours a day or more for 6 days every single week. Now this strategy was great. It provided much better working conditions for all, and before long this strategy was widely adopted in most of Europe. Countries like Germany and Poland implemented it in 1918, Denmark adopted the strategy in 1919, Belgium in 1924, but other countries outside of Europe had to suffer on for quite some time. So we should consider ourselves lucky for the 40-hour work week, right? Well, the simple answer is yes, of course we should. People to this day in other countries have it much worse, but here in the West there is a trade-off. When we compare the working conditions of modern day Britain to those of the 1900s, or even worse, the pre-industrial revolution days, we fail to acknowledge the socio-economic and geopolitical changes which have happened in the last 100 or so years. So we must pick a more recent focal point, something which has more relation to what we see today. And for this, I've chosen the year 1975. Now you may be asking, why have we chosen 1975? Well, there's a very good reason for this. Up until the mid, if not the late 70s into the early 80s, pay and conditions for most workers were moving in the right direction. Productivity for workers had been increasing since the 1940s, and pay had been moving at a similar rate. Now here we have a graph that shows this very clearly. It shows us the productivity of workers and the compensation for this work. Simply put, it shows us how hard workers work and the value that they have to their company versus the amount they are paid by the company. Now going back to the point, the reason why I chose 1975 is because looking at the chart from the mid 70s into the early 80s, we see this trend start to change. Worker productivity continues to increase at the same rate, whilst pay starts to stagnate. And this is where the problem with the 40-hour work week actually comes in. It's about value for money, value for workers, and this is where we are seeing things go downhill in real terms. Now before I start to acknowledge the problems that we are facing, we must actually have a look at the benefits that we have in the first world. We have safety, we have good healthcare, we have cars and technology. So we live in a world of great opulence, no matter what we may think. However, it doesn't mean that we should be happy to have decreased power, and that's what we are seeing in the past 50 or so years. We shouldn't be happy to own nothing. And this draws me back to the original point which we were initially focused on. Many of you watching will have parents or grandparents who will probably tell you stories about growing up in the 50s, 60s or even 70s. They will tell you stories about how they could get a nice car and move into their own property aged 18 and have an abundance of cash for weekends going out. And this is a problem that we face in our society nowadays. This is impossible. It's very hard for a young professional, say under 35, working in what would traditionally be considered a good job, to do all of these things which an 18-year-old from the 50s could do. Now imagine the conditions for an 18-year-old now. Yes, we have some things in society a lot better for young people, but pay is not one of them. Now for the comparison, I must draw on the UK because this is the example that I am familiar with. I know it is almost impossible for 18-year-olds to move out and have their own car, all whilst working one job at the same time. It simply isn't something which can happen anymore. And that's what we're seeing as a problem. In real terms, pay has decreased, but productivity has continued to rise. Now, if we were playing fair, we could fix this issue very simply. We need to do one of two things. We have two options. Now, the first one is to reduce the working week and keep pay the same as what it is right now. Let's use an example. Let's say that productivity has doubled. Well, we should either half pay or double pay and keep workers working what they are right now. Obviously, pay is the same as what it has been previously, but the productivity has gone up. So we must either pay people more for the work that they do, or we must simply cut the amount of hours which people work, obviously giving people more free time to do things that they enjoy. But neither of these things are happening at the moment. And we've been tricked into a way of thinking. I am not somebody who advocates that everybody goes out and makes their own business, but that shouldn't be something which people have to do. Right now we see working conditions which are fair, but they should be fairer. Because through inflation, tax, and other factors, we have seen real terms pay for workers go down month after month, year after year. And we're in a point right now in society where wealth distribution is becoming even more unequal, as the rich hold even more than ever, and the poor and even the traditionally middle class struggle to live a decent life. Workers are being used for their output. They are being seen as nothing more than a statistic, and they are being offered the lowest wages that companies can get away with. And the biggest trick of them all is simply this. Back in the 1980s, a dad could have worked in a video store. He could have had enough money to support his wife, 3 kids, and have 2 cars on the driveway. They would have gone on holiday once or maybe even twice per year. Nowadays, we are tricked into thinking it's a good idea to have 2 parents in the workplace doing professional jobs. Now, let's not make this about gender, because I don't think it is something which boils down to gender. Let's simply go over the fact of it. In the modern day, it takes a mum and dad, 2 people, working full-time professional careers. And if they are lucky, they may then get the privilege of owning 2 cars and going on a holiday. The trick is simply this. We've been tricked into thinking it's a good idea to have 2 people working for a single wage, because that is what has happened. Productivity has massively increased, both on an individual basis but on a household basis, as nowadays it's more likely that 2 parents go out into the workplace. And still, people struggle to get by. We see 2 parents working a professional job each, and then they can only afford the privileges that an 80s dad working a job 40 hours a week but not a professional position could have achieved. And that's a problem that we are seeing. That is the scam of the 9 to 5 essentially. It's unfortunate, but it is the truth. People work long hours. People are not rewarded fairly. People should be paid significantly more than what they are, and this is a scam of the system that we are seeing right now. The middle class and the poorer classes are being tricked into working longer and longer hours for less and less pay, resulting in the benefit of more profit for upper class workers. And like I said, the distribution of wealth just appears to be getting worse.